Third lecturer of the first session, I would like to call upon Nick Dagan Best from Canada, Human Ephemeris, and his lecture topic is the Venus Synodic Cycle. I request Nick to please come forward.
Okay, good, ready to go. My deepest grazie to Ms. Galila for stepping up at the last minute, and also to Shamal for literally reconstructing my slideshow from scratch. Here we are. Today's talk is about, it's basically part two to Julia's talk earlier. Ironically, we had us scheduled back-to-back so that I could follow up on where she was leading you with the Venus star, but alas, apparently it's much easier to reconcile the tropical and synodic zodiacs than it is Apple and Microsoft technology. Ironically, Steve Jobs coming up right in the middle of all that ties it nicely together. My work here with the Venus synodic cycle, basically Julia's already explained the five-pointed star, how we have 5 of these retrogrades every 8 years. And what I've done is I've streamlined the 8-year Venus synodic cycle into a new sort of 20-part division. I'll show it to you now. All right, so let's imagine if this one circle represents one Venus synodic cycle, which is 8 years minus 2 days, 2,920 days. That evenly breaks down, into 20 equal parts. 20 equal parts of 146 days each. So I've basically broken down that 8-year minus 2-day cycle into 20 equal parts. The red sections represent what Julia was talking about, the retrogrades, where Venus moves from evening to morning star in a slow retrograde motion. The white sections represent the following periods, which are morning star, as Venus accelerates towards its eventual external conjunction. The blue sections move as when Venus moves from morning to evening star. It makes a conjunction to the sun, and it's traveling very quickly. And finally, we have the black sections, which are the evening star, as Venus gradually decelerates towards its next retrograde, its next red period. But I've taken this a little bit further, and I've numbered them. There's red 1, white 1, blue 4, black 4, etc. Again, this full circle represents 8 years minus 2 days and 20 equal divisions of 146 days. And the red and blue sections are measured out 73 days on either side of the interior or exterior conjunctions. Okay, once again it sort of skips. All right, so the red 1 phase is the Venus retrograde that we had earlier in 2017 in tropical Aries, or if you like, in sidereal Pisces. And that's 2017. Group 2 is the one that we'll have later this year, a Venus retrograde in tropical Scorpio, or if you like, sidereal Libra. But in a more expanded version of this talk, I have examples I cite for the red 1 group. For instance, Adolf Hitler was born and died during a red 1, and Stalin and Roosevelt also died during red 1s. And then for the red 2, I point out that Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle were both born during red 2 Venus retrogrades, and Charles de Gaulle, in fact, also died during red 2 retrogrades. And I run through all of their chronologies and highlighting the specific red 1 periods throughout their lives, or the red 3 periods. And what you're going to see with the examples I do show you is that many very notable lives, and actually in my experience very ordinary lives, the clients who come to me, one can find in a human chronology very often a sort of a consistent pattern of either some people's lives will frequently have a red 1 show up from birth to death and marriage and professional highlights, or a red 3, or so on and so on. So I'm going to show you 4 examples today of people whose lives from birth to death followed this very specific pattern. And again, these are little 146-day intervals that occur every 8 years. It's about 5% of total time, and so it's very, very striking. It's almost like a game of roulette, if you will, like a 20 part roulette wheel, and you would get kicked out of a casino if you kept getting the same number over and over again. The casino would shut the game down, and that's what's really striking about this method. Is it's something that really sort of occurs too frequently to just be a sort of random incident. And the other thing is, the beauty of this method is, especially for these purposes, this is a method that speaks to both. It doesn't matter if you present it in a tropical or sidereal zodiac. This is a method that and a perspective that stands on its own. It's really, in my view, most likely, this is my speculation, but most likely this is knowledge that was known to whoever it was who designed horoscopic astrology. This is sort of Neo-Babylonian astrology, if you will. It's just a matter of studying timelines and seeing these frequencies repeat themselves over and over. All right, I'm going to get started now. I'm going to go into a red 3. Oh, suddenly oh, there we are. Okay, so red 3 is a retrograde. These days, we have it going from, have it going through tropical Gemini. But if we go back to 1916, well, anyway, for some reason the clicker skips through slides. Richard Nixon, the former US president, was not born with a Venus retrograde, but I can demonstrate how repeatedly very key events in his life occurred during red 3 Venus retrogrades, starting with his marriage. He married his wife. This is going to happen over and over again. You're going to see a lot of weddings that tie into this cycle. Richard Nixon married his wife, Pat, when Venus was in its retrograde phase in Cancer in what I call the red 3 period. Similarly, why does it do this? I just pressed once. Okay, there we are. 8 years later, his daughter was born during a Venus retrograde. So we're seeing a family thing. But at the same time, in 1948, there were two very crucial events or parts of his early political career that helped him, as a young congressman, become very well known in American national politics. One was the passing of an anti-communist legislation, and the other were these very famous trials in the summer of 1948 looking for communists in the American government. 8 years following that, in 1956, by now Richard Nixon is, it keeps jumping ahead, I don't want it to do that. All right, come on, do what I want. There we are. 1956, Nixon is vice president, and he's vice president to President Eisenhower. Eisenhower wants to replace him, but Nixon sort of maneuvers his way to maintain his position by giving a big press conference and declaring that he accepts Eisenhower's invitation to remain vice president, even though Eisenhower didn't do that, sort of putting Eisenhower in an awkward position. But it really becomes interesting when Nixon is president in 1972. Two of the most famous events of his presidency: number one, signing a major anti-nuclear treaty with the Soviet Union, followed shortly by the Watergate break-in. Of course, as soon as I mentioned Richard Nixon, everyone immediately thinks of Watergate. So just to recap his life, he was married during a red 3. One of his children was born during a red 3. The early sort of critical elements of his political career that made him famous in the nation occurred during a red 3, and then the events leading to his greatest achievement and his greatest downfall politically occurred during a red 3. So this is a remarkable collection of events, rather unambiguous, I would say, that indicate that his life seems to be maneuvering according to a red 3 rhythm, if you will. Okay, now I'm going to be talking about a red 4. The last time we had a red 4 Venus retrograde was in early 2014. I'm going to be talking about someone very well known to these parts. First off, I'm going to be talking about Indira Gandhi, if my clicker will cooperate. There we are. Now, Indira Gandhi was not born during a red 4, but she was born about 9 to 10 days before a red 4 began. And for those of you Western astrologers, and maybe some even Eastern astrologers who know about secondary progressions, one would say when she was about 9-10 years old, her chart would have progressed into a red 4 period. But there's, again, a bunch of events in her life that rather unambiguously point to a red 4 pattern in her life. Number one, come on, clicker. There we are. She was married during a red 4. She married Feroz Gandhi in 1942 during a Red 4 Venus retrograde phase. 4 years later, where we stand now, the Indian Republic was founded in 1950 during a Red 4 phase, and her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, was the first prime minister. President, prime minister, oh, okay, I've lost track of that. 8 years later, Indira's husband, Feroz, who's also a politician, exposes a corruption scandal that embarrasses his own father-in-law's government. And this leads to a weird sort of family schism in Indira's life. And we're going to see that family schisms actually show up repeatedly in this Red 4. 8 years, oh wait, we've missed a very crucial, oh no, we're missing a slide. We're missing a slide when we reconstructed my presentation. In 1966, during a Red 4 retrograde, is when in fact Indira Gandhi became Prime Minister of India. So that's obviously a very important little detail in her life. It's the reason we're talking about her today. And then following that, there we are. 8 years after that, her oldest son Sanjay met his future wife Maneka Anand. This is going to be very important later on because she's going to eventually become a politician herself and a member of an opposition party to her mother-in-law. Again, we're seeing this family schism in the Nehru-Gandhi family surface during these Red 4 periods. 8 years after this, in 1982, Maneka Anand is now a widow. In fact, her husband, Sanjay, died during a Red 3 retrograde in 1980 in a plane crash, which is interesting because Indira's father also died during a Red 3 retrograde in 1964. And in fact, Maneka Anand was born during a Red 3 Venus retrograde, as was Indira's other female nemesis, her aunt, Nan Pandit, was born during a Red 3 Venus retrograde. So there's also a Red 3 pattern running here. But going to the Red 4, this was when the schism between Indira Gandhi and her daughter-in-law erupted, and Indira basically evicted her daughter-in-law, the widowed Maneka Anand, or Maneka Gandhi now, from her home and her grandchild. And this is a family schism that still carries into Indian politics today, which I find very interesting. Okay, now my next example, I'm going to be talking, I've got two more people to discuss. They're both famous figures in Russian politics. I was also going to talk about Stalin, but he's not going to be in the presentation today. But Vladimir Lenin was born during a Red 4 Venus retrograde, as was his younger sister Maria, who was also an important Bolshevik revolutionary, also born during a Red 4. So that's two children in a family born during a Red 4. And 8 years after Maria was born, their father died. And this is an important event because with the death of the father, the oldest brother winds up, as a sort of a consequence of this death, the family is sort of left to fend for itself, and the oldest brother becomes very politicized, and he's in fact executed by the Tsar for participating in a plot to assassinate the Tsar, which in turn politicizes the young Lenin, and eventually, of course, he's going to wind up killing the Tsar in some part in revenge for the Tsar having killed his brother. So that's the death of the father. 8 years after this, we have Lenin didn't marry his wife during the Red 4 retrograde, but he did in fact meet his future wife at some point in February 1894 during a Red 4 retrograde. 8 years, and another thing that is very interesting is that the royal family that Lenin would one day have executed, they also got engaged during the same Red 4 Venus retrograde. That's just a little aside there. 8 years following this, Lenin published a pamphlet called What Is to Be Done. And this was a very widely circulated pamphlet. It basically made Lenin famous. It's not unlike what we saw with Richard Nixon earlier. It's like the work that makes his reputation, that makes him a viable leader when the revolution eventually comes. Another thing that occurs during Red 4s in Lenin's life is humbling or humiliating situations. He was of course, he's a Bolshevik, and he was fighting with the Menshevik faction. And in 1910, during a Red 4 period, Lenin was ordered to basically make peace with the Mensheviks against his will. Although this quickly fell apart, it was probably the most humbling or humiliating event in Lenin's political life. Followed 8 years later by a very famous thing. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin agrees to sign a peace treaty with the Germans to get out of the First World War, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And in this treaty, it's again a very humiliating piece of work because the Soviets are forced to give up huge pieces of land to the Germans. And that's basically it. Lenin did not live to see another Red 4 period, but to recap, he was born during a Red 4, his sister was born during a Red 4, his father died during a Red 4, he met his wife during a Red 4, he published his most notable pre-revolutionary work during a Red 4, and he signed a very important treaty, basically the biggest political maneuver of his life after the revolution during a Red 4. So we see another sort of unambiguous pattern in his life. And finally, I'm going to be talking about the Red 5. The Red 5 retrograde is one that these days occurs in tropical Leo, or if you like, in sidereal Cancer. And we have another, this is the only person who's still alive that I'm going to be talking about today. This is Vladimir Putin. Winking at us. Now, Vladimir Putin, again, was not born during a Red 5, but I'm going to show you a bunch of things about his life, both personal and public, that occurred during a Red 5. Starting with, come on, clicker, there we go. Starting with the birth of his mother. Vladimir Putin's mother was born in 1911 during a Red 5 phase. Jumping ahead to his life in 1975, sometime in the summer of 75, in June of 75, he graduated from the University of St. Petersburg, and every biography says he immediately enlisted to serve in the KGB. So he became a KGB agent during a Red 5 period. 8 years following this, he married his wife in 1983 during a Red 5 period. We're seeing a lot of these weddings. If I could have gone on, if I had more time, I would have shown you how Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle, how they married their wives during very crucial the Red periods, either Red 1 or Red 3, that are critical in their lives. 8 years following this, in 1991, there was an attempted coup. The Soviet hardliners were trying to stop the Soviet Union from falling apart. And it was due to this event. The following day, Vladimir Putin resigned from the KGB. So remember, 16 years earlier, he enlisted in the KGB during a Red 5. And in 1991, during a Red 5, he left the KGB. So that's an interesting little sort of begin and end that line up according to the Red 5. 9 years following this, in 1999, Vladimir Putin's father dies. Now remember, Lenin's father died during a critical Red period. Indira Gandhi's father died during a Red 3, which is, along with the Red 4, critical to her. So we see these Red periods show up with parental death. If I could have gone into all these World War II figures, I could have told you about how Stalin, Mussolini, and Winston Churchill, their mothers all died during a Red 1, and how de Gaulle's mother died during a Red 3 and his father died during a Red 3. We see parental death along with wedding and these professional highlights all sort of line up in these very specific little, again, 146-day intervals that occur every 8 years. It's a remarkable ratio. Now, shortly, Vladimir Putin literally was coming back from his father's funeral in 1999 when just a few days later, come on, clicker. Come on, there we are. Whoops. Just a few days later, he was named Prime Minister of Russia by Boris Yeltsin. This is the day that most of us heard the name Vladimir Putin for the very first time. Pretty much any of us outside of Russia heard his name on this day during a Red 5 period when he became Prime Minister. Later in the year, he would ascend to the presidency, and of course, he's basically been in power ever since. 8 years following that, in 2007, this was a very important event. Putin himself campaigned for Sochi to host the 2014 Winter Olympics, which was important because back in the Soviet days, the Soviet Union was going to host the 1980 Olympics, and they were boycotted by many nations because of the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. So this was a means of righting a wrong and restoring the reputation of Russia in terms of the Olympic community. So, and interestingly, the 2014 Sochi Olympics occurred during a Red 4 period, but I don't have enough time to get into how Red 4 is relevant to Vladimir Putin. This is another Red 5 period. And finally, the last slide in this presentation, in 2015, this wasn't very long ago, a lot of you might remember this, when Barack Obama was still president of the United States, during a Red 5 period, Putin and Obama gave speeches on the same day at the United Nations, and Putin basically embarrassed, humiliated Obama in front of the global community at the United Nations. You can see from the photo there who looks happy and who doesn't look happy. It's pretty obvious what's going on. And this is another Red 5 moment, and a moment of sort of triumph, if you will, for the Russian regime versus their lifelong adversary, the United States. So to recap, the whole, this is a method that transcends horoscopic astrology. Even if you're working with the chart of someone who doesn't know their time of birth, if they know their life chronology well, you can very often reconstruct their lives according to this Venusian system. Time and time again, I find people whose lives run either according to a Red 1 rhythm, a Red 4 rhythm. Sometimes it's multiple rhythms, like Indira Gandhi, for instance, runs by a Red 4 and a Red 3, or Winston Churchill runs by a Red 2 and Red 3, and so on and so forth. We're talking again about things very often, it's not just the birth of an individual, but the birth or death of their parents, their weddings, their very critical professional highlights or things that basically make their name in the public world. All these, and finally death. Very often death pops up in this same rhythm again. So you're really seeing a pattern, a very simple pattern emerge from this small little fraction of time. That's basically it. I have many more examples. I only decided to choose 4 so that I would be able to fit this into half an hour, but I could go on and on. I actually see a hand up. Maurice, you wanted to ask me a question? Can I go? Okay, Maurice Fernandez just asked me can I use this method to go ahead of time? Yes, I would say absolutely. I first stumbled across this method in 2002, actually during a Red 2 period of Venus retrograde in Scorpio, and the first person person whose life I stumbled across that sort of illuminated this method to me was the life of the film director Roman Polanski. I noticed that, for instance, his mother died in a concentration camp. Basically the Second World War, when the concentration camps were freed, was during a Red 1 period. He acted in his first film during a Red 1 period. His first public acclaim as a film director occurred during a Red 1. His wife, Sharon Tate, encountered Charles Manson during a Red 1, not the eventual murder, but when Charles Manson first went to the house where Sharon Tate would be murdered, and when he actually encountered Sharon Tate face to face. The fact that put Charles Manson in prison, basically, occurred during Red 1. Roman Polanski, later in 1977, raped a girl during 1977, which resulted in his being kicked out of the United States, or fleeing the United States to escape the justice system. He directed his film The Pianist in 2001 during a Red 1 period. So there I was in 2002 looking at this timeline of events in Roman Polanski's life and realizing I didn't have the system of calling it Red 1 yet, but I realized that this Venus retrograde, this small period of time, always represented really important turning points in the man's life. And that was in 2002, but sure enough, so I was looking ahead to the next retrograde, which would occur in 2009, and like clockwork, Roman Polanski surfaced in the news. There was a documentary about him in 2008 that presented new facts about his rape case and how it was handled by the justice system. And in 2009, there was a campaign to try and have his conviction repealed because he was convicted in absentia. It didn't work, but he was basically, during that window of time, he had the chance to go back to the United States and stand trial and probably or possibly have his conviction repealed. He opted not to, but out of the blue, it was just in that window of time during another Red 1 phase that occurred. And he resurfaced again this year in 2017 in the news during a Red 1 phase. I forget the exact details of it, but indeed, to answer your question, Maurice, once you can identify this pattern, it's very, very likely to repeat itself over the course of an individual's life. So if you are reading a chart for someone and you identify that they have a Red 2 pattern, a Red 3 pattern, then this is actually very valuable advice or information for any client, because you can say, okay, here are these windows of time that occur every 8 years, these little periods. You can alert them to be conscious to this. You can alert them, this is always a pivot, a turning point in your life, and it's likely to continue to be so. There are ways to determine this. There are different ways. Sometimes it's because the person is born during a Red 2 or sorry, Maurice's question was, do you know ahead of time if someone's going to respond to a Red 2 or Red 3? There are ways to determine this. For instance, in the case of Roman Polanski, he had a, thank you, I'll be done very soon. Roman Polanski was born with a tropical Libra rising, tropical Mars in Libra, close to the ascendant, and then tropical Uranus and tropical Aries, rather, on the descendant. So that Red 1 Venus retrograde always makes a conjunction to his Uranus, crosses his descendant, opposes his Mars. So one has the sense that, yeah, this is going to be this, and all the events I described, his mother dying in a concentration camp, convicted of rape, triumph in cinema, and his wife encountering her future murderer. All these things sort of fall into this pattern of the Venus crossing the Mars-Uranus. So to answer your question, yes, it does take the skill. This is when one does introduce the horoscopic method into this idea. The idea itself sort of transcends horoscopic astrology. It transcends any zodiacal system, but one can apply it to whatever horoscopic system one uses and use it as a quite a reliable tool. All right, well, did you have a question, Lynn? Right. Well, I think this is a good question because people often ask me this. The method in itself is really just a timing system. It times. It shows you where the where. It doesn't necessarily show you the what. It shows you the where and the when, not the what. That being said, I have found I've got further work developed on this. Of course, what happens during a Venus retrograde is that Venus moves from an evening star to a morning star. And I have found some very interesting distinctions looking at birth charts and events that occur either during a morning star or an evening star phase. That's when you start to get into the nuanced element of using this method, but I don't have time. I really wanted to just be able to present this idea that this small 146-day interval every 8 years can speak volumes. In fact, doing a lot with very little astrologically, which is a tough thing to do. Okay, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank the panel for hearing me today and allowing me to present this work. And again to Shimal and Ms. Galila for adapting to my technical problems today. Thank you very much.